I'm Nigel Titchener-Hooker. I'm the Dean of the Engineering Faculty, and it's my huge pleasure to chair this evening's seminar in the Centre for Transport Studies series, Provocations in Transport. And Nick Tyler, who is our first speaker this evening, has given me a little bit of an aide-memoire to tell you how this series came about. Basically what Nick and the transport people here wanted to do was to create a series of seminars which were as unconventional as UCL is in terms of its original sort of mantra. The idea is to provide an opportunity, an open opportunity for people to discuss issues in transport that challenge the conventional views. So this is, I guess, rather like sort of Chatham House rules. The whole idea here is to have controversial debate, to think the unthinkable, and to really push the boundaries of what we think is sort of orthodoxy in transport. So the idea then is to think about the issues in transport, think about matters that are perhaps not readily discussed elsewhere, which defy sort of conventional debate. And as you might imagine, Nick is the sort of the originator of the idea. The title Provocations, I think, really fits with Nick as an individual, sort of a bit of an agent provocateur, if I can say that. Turning then to Nick, I think very few of us actually need an introduction to Nick. We all know him and love him as our Chadwick Professor in Civil Engineering. But I think Nick is very much more than a professor at UCL. I often talk to others about Nick as a real polymath. I vividly remember seeing Nick strumming the piano. I believe he's a grade 8 pianist, Nick? He keeps all sorts of things hidden under that bushel of hair he so proudly has. So Nick, though, is, I guess, no stranger to controversy. If I think about what he did in civil engineering, not content as head of department just to think of a redesign of the curricula, Nick basically threw the rule book out the window and started from scratch, and others have tried to catch up since. So what Nick has done and initiated here at University College London has now been incorporated into what we call the integrated engineering programme, which really looks at problem-based teaching rather than the very sort of serried and rather static way in which much of engineering is taught in the United Kingdom. So Nick is entirely original, and I think what you're going to hear from him this evening will demonstrate that. Nick has taken as his theme for his talk this evening, 3 things about transport. And he's going to introduce 3, I think, very radically different aspects of the way in which one may think about transport. He's passionate about the influence that transport and, in fact, the whole of the environment, the built environment, has on individuals, on populations, and on society, and how that environment actually shapes us, and indeed how transport shapes the way in which we respond as well. Nick's view is intrinsically people-centric, and I think we're going to hear some very provocative things this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to what I would share with you as Nick's, and he's going to get the relevance of this, Nick's pearls of wisdom. So, for those of you in the audience who don't know what I'm talking about, that's for over a drink afterwards. So, Nick, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nigel, for that introduction. As Nigel said, the idea of these sessions is to be a bit different and not just to be yet another seminar, as we all go to lots of those. So this is going to be a little bit different. And why it's called 3 Things About Transport, well, I'm sort of writing a book at the moment which is going to be called 6 Things About Transport. But I hadn't figured out what the last 3 were going to be. So the 3 things. And the idea, the most important word in many ways in that title is the word about. Because what I mean by about is these are things which are sort of sideways, outside the main drag of what we think of as transport, rather than something about is near to transport. So it's just different ways of looking at transport and how they might come together to feed us forward into the new year. So, where do we start from? Well, we are where we are. If we look around the world, we have a very rapidly urbanizing population. We have 7 billion people on the planet. We know it's going to go up by a lot to 9 billion in a few years' time and all the rest of it. And if you look at most cities around the world, what you'll see is massive congestion, pollution, and all the rest, and all those sorts of downsides of all this. And I think to myself, well, we are where we are. How on earth are we going to move on from here and have a better world in the future? And the question in my mind is, well, if we look at how we managed to arrive at this congested, polluted world, if we just do the same thing for the next couple of hundred years, we're going to end up with an even more congested and even more polluted world. So actually, maybe we just need to sort of cut to the chase and change the way we think, and then see what actually happens. So that's kind of what's sort of driving this. So what we're really thinking about is what actually can we do to make the world a better place. So the first of my three things is music. And I spent, for those who don't know or can't remember, the first sort of 7 or 8 years, I guess, of my professional life, I was a professional musician, not playing the piano, as it happens, but playing the oboe. And the more I've gone through my career since then, and the more I've realized that actually studying music at that kind of high-performing level is a pretty cool way to think about engineering. Why? Well, these are sort of 5 typically known or considered things about music. When people are trying to get money for getting a music class in a school, these are the 5 things they point at. And the first one is creativity. How it engenders creativity. You can't really perform music without some level of mastery, so you've actually got to be able to do stuff. You can think music, but actually in the end you have to perform it. And that we very often, most of the time, do in an ensemble, and that means that we have to do things together. And one of the grand skills I think the musicians have that it would be lovely to see in engineers and architects is the ability to know when you're the most important person in the room and when you're the least important person in the room, and to act accordingly. And musicians do that, at least between themselves. They will do that pretty instinctively. There is the issue of the connection with the community, and music is very much a culture of people. It's not something which is esoteric and sitting in a library somewhere. This is actually of the people, and you can go to any place around the world and you will hear music. It may be different kinds of music, but you will hear it there. And the relationship between musicians and the community is a very strong one. And finally, it has the sense of flow. Music is a time-dependent process. And actually what musicians do a lot of, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, they do a lot of bending of time. And actually how we perceive time in music is very different from the way that we perceive time, for example, in physics. So we can wave goodbye to the Newtonian clock. We can think much more about a biological clock. We can go away from discrete differentiation, for example, and into analog continuity. And these kind of things in music are really important. That's why one of the reasons why a live music performance always sounds much more ambient or much warmer than a digitized performance. So it's because it's analog rather than digital, and we don't have all the little breaks in between, and actually we are sensitive to those breaks, even though they're very tiny. So music actually is a really important thing. But actually I could have said, what does engineering do for you, and have the same things. And that's one important takeaway already, because they come fast. Right? So let's sort of think a little bit more about music. So this is a question I always like asking you. Why does a grandfather clock say tick-tock? It's a very interesting question. I can go to any country in the world, I'll find out what a grandfather clock says, and it will be exactly the same. It won't be tick-tock. In Spain it's tic-tac, for example, but always it is 2 different sounds. And actually, if I played you, and I'm not going to, if I played you the sound of the tick and the tock of a grandfather clock, of course they're identical. So why do we always call it tick-tock? Why do we think that there is a difference between the 2? And that is because neurologically we group things together, and the brain wants to find a pattern, and it therefore makes one more important than the other. And so we have the sense that if you listen to a grandfather clock, you will think it goes tick-tock, but actually it's going tick-tick. And that becomes important. So if we look at poetry, for example, famous line of Shakespeare, I'm sure we all learnt that. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, line from Macbeth, is of course in the middle of a play, and there's a bit more of the play. I'm not going to do the whole play. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Wonderful piece of Shakespeare, beautiful written. But actually, that's not what it sounds like. Because actually what Shakespeare wrote looks a bit more like that. So what Shakespeare wrote, these are stresses. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Rhythm transforms the meaning. And when we're looking at a transport system or a city, we are looking at many rhythms going through the city, and we are doing it ourselves. We walk down the street, we create a rhythm. And how we actually understand all the multiplicity of rhythms going on in a city at the same time, that is actually very much what we're trying to do when we're designing a transport system. So actually, we're really creating a piece of music. So we have a journey, and all music, pretty much anywhere, goes on a very simple journey, really. This is music, that's it. Music sort of kind of goes from dissonance to consonance. So what a composer does is they set up a dissonance in some way or other, and then we all want it to change into something consonant, and then they will give us consonance, and that gives us a sort of kind of resolution. So to give you an idea, here is a dissonant chord. Okay, do you like that? I didn't want to give you too dissonant a chord. I didn't want to frighten you too much. But that is commonly known, or uncommonly known, as a diminished seventh chord. And the thing about that chord, I'll play it again. So if you want to shut your ears, you can. I'll just play it again. It wants to go somewhere. It's very, even for non-trained musicians, you have this, it wants to go somewhere. Where does it want to go? Well, to be very simple, it wants to go there. And that's basically how music works. You set up the dissonance and then you resolve it. So you have this tension and the tension is released. Now, of course, you can make a bigger gap between the dissonance and the consonance, and that's kind of sort of the art. And whether you're talking about an 18th century composer in Germany, or whether you're talking about a 60s rock band, or whether you're talking about somebody playing in India or China, the same thing applies. What you're actually doing is creating this shift from dissonance to consonance to get that resolution. But it's a bit... We can also look at that in a different way. So when you're setting up the dissonance, what you're actually doing is creating an anticipated need. The need is for a resolution, for an outcome, and you're setting up that anticipation. You resolve it with your consonance, you satisfy the need, and you then get an outcome. And actually, we can start to play with that a little bit as to what we really mean by doing that. And another way of looking at this is to take value engineering. Value engineering is a very dirty word at the moment because it's been stolen by people who think that value engineering is to make things cheaper. I'm never one to make things cheaper, but actually the original sense of value engineering is actually was really designed for process engineering when they were trying to figure out what's the useful investment to be made in a process. So you take an object. Do I have an object? I do have an object. I will find it. There it is. Wonderful what this object is. This object is a pen. Okay? So here is a pen, and this object has a function, and the function of that pen might be to make marks on paper, and those marks might be words, maybe they're poetry, there might even be music, and you think that's the function of the pen, but actually no, it isn't, because I show you this pen. For those of you who can see this pen, it's not a sort of ballpoint biro. So actually it is telling you something about itself and possibly, maybe, the person who's holding the pen. It also, of course, comes apart, and you'll see it's actually a fountain pen. So it's telling you that this is obviously an old crank who has fountain pens, but it's telling you something about me. And therefore, and I could write a name on it, it could be an advertising thing, there's all sorts of things this pen can do. And the more functions this pen can actually perform, the greater its overall functionality. And that is the essence of value engineering, is how we actually get that functionality. But functionality only works, or functions only work, if they work. So the important thing is actually to make sure that we have functions. So the definition, if you like, of a function is something that works in this context. So I might have an aspiration to have a pen which will persuade somebody to give me, £50 million. That's my aspiration. I might have an achievement of less than that, okay? But in the end, that's the function. Has the pen performed its function? So the extent to which the pen is actually functional is a question of the relationship between function and functionality, or function and achievement. Aspiration and achievement. And we can look at that a little way. I just wanted to step one little bit back. Functionality is the sum of lots of functions. And we can see that when I start to want to think about value, we're talking about inputs as well. So we have that functionality, the sum of all the functions, and the use of resources, not just money. Could be money, but it could be many things. And then we can say, well, actually, my functionality is really achievement over aspiration by the use of resources. And that gives me that sense of value. So the question then is, how do I actually figure out my achievement? And what does that actually mean? If I'm thinking about music, for example, here's an image. This is, for those of you who may recall, this is the Dave Brubeck Quartet. And they are playing away there. In fact, it's the drummer that is playing, a bit on the piano. But what is actually going on there is that they are actually changing the aspiration of what they would like to play against the achievement of actually playing it. They are improvising. They have a pattern. They individually, between the four of them, have an idea about they have an aspiration of what this is going to sound like, and then the performance delivers the achievement of that. And so we then understand what the music is. And so that sense of performance is something which I think we need to get much more of when we start to think about things like urban design and the design of a transport system. So let's think about not how many kilometers, how many pounds, how many trains, how many buses, how many people, all those sorts of things. What we want is the performance. How does it act in time? And then how do we actually measure that, and then measure the resources that we use in order to put into that? And so when they're doing that improvisation, they're actually having to do many, many things. And one of the things they do is do something. So the drummer hits the drum, or the pianist touches the key on the keyboard, and so on. That's an action. But what happens before that action is that they have to be, to some extent at least, consciously aware of that. So some psychologists in the 1980s were playing around with this. They didn't have anything like music. They had a button. They had to press a button. And what they noticed is there's a spike in the brain actually when the finger goes to push the button. But there's a couple of hundred milliseconds before is a spike that is essentially them being aware that they have to push the button. So it was a choice of pushing a button when the light was green or blue. But the interesting bit was that they noticed that you don't get that spike if you haven't had this spike. So this spike is what they called preconscious readiness. And what this is a spike in the brain which is kind of setting up the brain to be conscious. And you won't have that spike if you haven't got this one. And then sometime before that, you have the actual stimulus. So you can imagine doing things. So the sort of kind of thing that you could be doing with all of this, if you're not the Dave Brubeck Quartet, it could be an orchestra. I always love this picture. Right? This is it's a Northwest German orchestra playing in the Ukraine. And you can see the conductor there. Right? He's a very dramatic conductor, has very big white cuffs on his shirt so that we can see him being highly dramatic. How many of the orchestra are actually looking at the conductor? right? His drama is not actually for the orchestra at all, it's for the people behind him. And so what's actually going on here? Well, the first thing is we have some conscious awareness. This is this person, I've just chosen this one. So they are listening, they can hear what's going on. And they will say, yes, that's right, we're playing the right piece, we're in the same piece, and that's all working pretty well, that's all conscious, and therefore I'm going to do something. In this case, we have the preconscious readiness. So actually, he is responding to information coming into his ear, and to a certain extent his eye, but coming into his ear from the sounds that are going on 500 to 700 milliseconds before he's actually going to do anything, and he's going to adjust what he does in the context of that information. And the brain receives, or has the capacity to receive something like 11 million bits per second of information. And the conscious awareness here, the capacity of the brain to deal with conscious awareness is something near a bit less than 80 bits per second. So there's a massive amount of stuff going on between the preconscious readiness and the conscious awareness. And that stuff is really important. It's not just sort of deciding what to throw away. So if you imagine walking down the street with a friend talking about last week's climate change or the week before's television or whatever it is you want to talk about, and you're walking down the street and you're having a great conversation, then think about what your feet are doing. And your feet have been negotiating maybe Camden Council's wonderfully uneven footway surface. Maybe they've been negotiating puddles or other things that you don't want to walk in, and all those sorts of things. That actually is not by some rhythmic machine-like repetitive, reflexive thing of your feet. That is actually driven by your brain making those judgments. And what's actually going on in those 700 milliseconds is we're converting from here to there, is actually some of what this guy is doing is actually driven by the preconscious stuff. And only a very, very tiny amount is driven by the conscious stuff. And that is exactly the same for you when you get on a train. It's exactly the same. And the difference with musicians is that they have to do it very fast and they do it in a very, very precise and very detailed way, and maybe they can do more things than we might normally do getting on a train in between the two. 700 milliseconds will produce quite a lot of notes in some cases. Then, of course, we have the actual action here, which is when we're doing something with our fingers and our hand, we're doing coordination and all that sort of stuff. So actually playing a concert, they're far too busy doing that stuff to pay any attention to this guy. So, when we start to look at the neurology of all that, there's a sort of bit of a kind of breakaway group in neurology who look at what they call the ecological brain. There's various words that get associated with it. One is the ecological brain, another is the embodied mind, and the other is inaction. So we're going to look at some of those later. But in this case, what they consider is we actually have two bodies. You may think it's hard enough to have one, but we have two bodies, and the first body we think about is what they call the living body. And the living body is essentially the organism, the physical organism. So you, standing up there, that's it, right? And so in your organism you have things like neurons and cells and stuff going on, and you do things. And so we can study that, and we can observe that, and we can collect data, and we can analyze the data, and we can understand absolutely what the living body is doing at any moment, if we wanted to. And we take strenuous efforts to make sure that that observation is not going to affect what the body is doing. We want it to be completely separate, and we go to enormous lengths both to try to do that and also to try and convince other people that we have not affected the result. So this is very much a sort of kind of way of looking at the body from a third-person exterior way of looking at it. The other body we have is called the lived body. Germans very conveniently have two words for body, and one is for lived and one is for living. We don't, so we have to deal with this. So the lived body is interesting because the lived body includes all of your genetic history. It includes all the past experiences that you've had since you could possibly remember and before. It includes things like the environment that is interacting with us. It's a cold room, so we are feeling that now. We have all the present experiences that we currently have, and we have the subjective and intersubjective interactions. So what you personally are thinking at this moment in time, and what you are thinking with other people at this moment in time. We are all in this room together. We're all at the same event, and we have all arrived from a completely different trajectory. Each of our lived bodies is completely different from everybody else's. And we have this moment of interaction right now, in this instant, and there's another instant, and then we move on and we have another set of future experiences in the future. So this instant is actually very important, and it's this instant that we need to design for when we talk about transport. So, turn it around a little bit. These are our present collective experiences. This is what we are all experiencing, the same kind of thing. We have all arrived from a different trajectory. We have our genes sitting in the corner, and we're all going to go on and have future experiences, of which this will be a past experience for some future event. Okay? So we're going to be playing the time. What on earth has this got to do with transport? Well, there's a train. And this is a train, you'll be relieved to hear, this is a train in our laboratory, because this is not London Underground's new air conditioning system. It is actually in our laboratory. We were doing some work for London Underground about the design of a new tube train, which they assure me will have a complete roof. And the question here, in this case, this is an experiment, so it's not like a real station, where we have everything else pretty much as it is. And what I'm wondering here is actually, there's about 120 people there. Are they all having the same experience? And of course, given the conversation we just had, not really. They have the same instantaneous, ephemeral experience, but they don't actually have the same complete experience. The perception of that is going to be coloured by their previous trajectory. And then we can start to think about that, so that's just to remind you, but I can turn around what I think about the past and the present and the future. And the first thing is, and this is very much out of the musical tradition, that the present doesn't exist. The present is actually the past. As soon as I play a note, it's gone. So if it's a wrong note, it's gone. If it's a bit out of tune, it's too late to change it. So the present is actually the past that is about to be present. And that's a continually moving theme. The past, well, in the past, I was thinking about the future. I'm aiming at the future. Therefore, the past is actually a future that was. And the future is actually the present that's yet to be. So when we're designing our transport system, what we're actually designing for is a kind of present yet to be. And because the present, how long does it last for? You know, how long is now? Well, Popple, who did all the work with the poetry, he would say now is 3 seconds long. But we could debate that. You know? So the question is, where are we pitching those people in the orchestra, for example, against this? This is, of course, what they're doing too. So we have, for example, some of this is actually to do with how they are perceiving they will be playing the music in the future, and that's the past. Some of them are actually, I blamed him for this, some of them are actually thinking about what the future is going to be like. He's thinking, well, how am I going to do the next bit? How am I going to stop these people from playing at the right time and all of those sorts of things? Some of them are actually figuring out what they're going to do about the note they've just played or just about to play, and that the interface between the two. And of course, and I just popped the genes back in here so you didn't think I've forgotten them, because the genes essentially are effectively the music in this case. So in other words, not as a blueprint. Music is not a blueprint, and genes are not a blueprint. The music is essentially a process. And all that is a starting point. The creation of the music doesn't exist until you play it. So this is simply a kind of pattern. These people interpret that pattern and go through all of this business, and that's how you get music. That is also how we design a city, and people respond to the city and perform in it, and that's how we get a city. And the question is, how do we actually get the kind of performance that we want? Mozart has no idea how his music's being played now. He didn't actually when it was being played, when he was playing in it, because it was the past yet to be. So we can do that with the train. It's the same sort of thing. Some of these people are thinking about what they're doing right now. Some of them are thinking about, well, maybe this is the future, and I'm thinking about, what did I think about this train? Is it a nice train? I don't think it is. Where am I going to stand in the train? Where am I going to sit? All those sort of things. And others are wondering, what happened? Okay, that's fairly typical. But we can turn all those around. And the interesting thing, and the reason I show that, is that actually each of these people is doing all three at the same time. We're wonderful things, human beings. And so we have to sort of think about how our minds deal with temporality when we're trying to figure out how we actually live our lives, and that applies a great deal to the transport system. And the third thing is around what I call verticality. It's a slightly ugly word. This is New York, not all of it, just one street. And vertical is kind of what you see there. And so what do we mean by vertical? Well, we have these very tall buildings, very little sky, and lots of hard surfaces and all the rest of it. And that's sort of kind of New York in a way, and actually many other cities. There are bits of London that could resemble. But essentially that sense of verticality is an important issue for us. So it might be worth thinking about what we think about verticality. So here's a very interesting graph. So the yellow line is today. Over here, 40,000 years ago, more or less, we have the sort of hunter-gatherers in the savannah, and 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged from the jungle into the savannah following an ice age. And why is it that Homo sapiens survived and not the other hominids? It's a kind of interesting question, which I won't answer. But certainly there are people in the anthropology world who believe that one of the reasons that Homo sapiens and not the others survived is to do with sociality. And I'll show you in a minute why that might be. But I wanted to put some perspective in here, because the first cities really appeared about 10,000 years ago. And they arose because people had to share water and stuff like that. So the first cities are about 8,000 years ago, which is actually quite recent compared with when we emerged into the savannah. But when did we first see a modern city as we would recognize? Actually, it's about 1750. So it's about 250 years ago. And the rate of change genetically is zilch. We are pretty much identical to these people in genetic terms. And this is probably Manchester, I think, is supposedly the first of the modern cities in the world. And that all happened because of the concentration of energy, and therefore you could have a factory and you could make lots of money, therefore you needed to have a lot of people to populate the factory, therefore you had to have a city, and et cetera, et cetera. That's only the last 250 years. And what we were actually designed for was this. This is the savannah. And you notice, the first thing that always strikes me with this picture is it's horizontal. Right? We don't have that narrow, tall thing. We have a huge sky. We have nothing much going on, this sort of random tree. We have nothing much going on the ground. This is the savannah. This is actually what we're designed for. And what does that actually mean for us? Well, first thing is, it's much easier to look left and right than up and down, or certainly to look up. We're not designed to look up because we never got eaten by things from above. So we're designed not to look up. You have to remember that. In terms of hearing, we have more or less hemispherical hearing. We're pretty good on left to right spatiality, a bit less good, not a lot less, but a little bit less good vertically, because we do have a sort of kind of blank spot sort of up here somewhere. It's where my hair was. And then we have things like touch. Why do we have such a huge sense organ for touch? Well, it's about wind and so on, which is a very horizontal type piece. We then have other senses. I won't go through all of the ones that we work with, but proprioception is an interesting one here, because proprioception, although it is not the balance mechanism, it's actually part of how we know where our feet are. Remember, we're interested in feet, walking along surfaces, and it does therefore enable some of the balance that we need. And also our feet are designed for coping with different kinds of surface. Feet are pretty good at walking along uneven surfaces. Wheels are pretty hopeless at going along uneven surfaces. If wheels were any good, we would have wheels. Then the mind is actually geared into seeking change and patterns and differences, not into seeing things always being the same. So that is one of the reasons why. So we're very good at spotting some tiny object in the distance. We have to make a decision if it's going to eat us or if we're going to eat it. You know, that's the sort of kind of thing. And that became important, and this is why those anthropologists believe that Homo sapiens survived, because they had the social capability to get together and between them to capture a large animal. Because once they moved out of the jungle into the savannah, food was much harder to find. And we have a big brain, and the big brain needs energy, and energy needs food. Therefore, you need food. And the idea that one person on their own could capture a mammoth was not really credible. So you had to gather together with other people, and that required sociality. So their theory is that that meant that they survived because they could eat rather better than the others. So we've got this sort of sense of horizontalism. Okay, we're designed horizontally. This is some work by Edward Hall, who only really has one D. This is by Edward Hall, and this is the sort of concept of social space. And social space is sort of important because it's how we interact. The distance between us when we have a conversation, the distance between us when we see that somebody is smiling or that we kind of recognize them, the distance rather larger, rather further away when we can sort of see somebody and we're not sure if we want to know that they're there or not, those sort of things. And of course the very small distance, which only a very few people are allowed to come close at that sort of distance. And this idea of social space is actually really quite important. And those sort of distances are around about up to maybe as much as 3 meters. It's very hard to have a conversation with somebody at 3 meters distance. You have to sort of shout a bit. But at 1.2 meters, for example, you can. But at 1.2 meters, you can only see a certain number of people at a time. So what you find is that groups tend to be sort of 3 or 4, and the fifth person sort of hovers around and they can't quite make it. And that's because your field of useful vision sits at that kind of radius, so at the kind of distance that you can talk to somebody, that's all you can see in one go. And to see the other person, you have to turn, and you lose one and gain the other. And so it doesn't really work very well. So we have a concept of a kind of social space horizontally of that sort of kind of dimension. But if we look vertically, it's a bit different. This is young Gale sort of trying to illustrate the kind of problem. So here we have a person on the second floor, about 6-ish meters up, and they are looking at the person down here, and they can sort of, at that level, you might be able to have a conversation with somebody at the level. I showed this in Havana one time, and they said, yes, of course we can have a conversation. 6 meters is nothing. We can have a conversation at 5 floors, and they probably could. But essentially, it's actually quite difficult. And when you think about those distance questions, how far can you project your voice, etc., that becomes quite an important issue. If you go up to the 4th floor, it gets even harder. And in fact, if we take this one, this is the sort of representation of that image. So from the person on the ground, this is what the person on the balcony looks like, and vice versa. And you can sort of make out that they're there. You might or might not be able to make out their face, and whether they're smiling or so on. You probably recognize them, but you wouldn't be able to do too much. You might be able to shout at them and say, bring me up a cup of coffee or something. If you look at the 4th floor, no, that's not going to happen. And this guy up here, in young Gale's drawing, he has an aeroplane. Okay? So verticality, we're not designed for verticality, and therefore it sort of does become a bit of an obstacle. So we need to sort of think about that, and that's quite important. How are we designing cities with very tall buildings in? Maybe we should think about that. So I have a question. These are traces of people, and I'm just wondering whether you can think what they were asked to do. Don't bother asking it. But just think about what you think they were asked to do. And actually, they were asked to walk in a straight line. And this was not on a Friday night after too many beers in the Jeremy Bentham. In this occasion, they were blindfolded. And what's quite fascinating, I think if I said I was going to blindfold you and ask you to walk in a straight line, most of us would imagine we would walk in something like a straight line. what's interesting, or we might think, well, actually I might deviate a bit. My left leg is shorter than my right. Actually, this is a really cool piece of German research when they tested for that. And look at this. Right? That is a 20-meter diameter circle. And you would think you would know if you were going in a 20-meter diameter circle. It's sort of kind of interesting, isn't it? So this is the same experiment, but they went to a different place. The top picture is in the Black Forest, lots of trees, so it's quite dark. And here we have a couple of trajectories here. So this one, the little arrows, if you can see the little arrows, that's where the direction that the sun was shining. And when you get the sunshine, you get a straight line. And when you don't get the sunshine, this is at night, you don't get a straight line. This is the Sahara Desert. There's quite a lot of sunshine in the Sahara Desert. So you tend to get straight lines. And it doesn't actually matter which way the sun is pointing, the line will be straight. So it's not that you're pointing at the sun, it's just simply the sun is there. This one, very German, they knew about this. This one is at night. Okay? And the interesting one about this one is that on this part, the moon was shining, and on this part, it wasn't. Okay? So, when we think of that New York street and the smallness of the sky, what you're actually doing is we're saying to people, actually, we would actually quite like to walk in a circle, in a sort of slight curve. That's what we would really like to do. Not too worried about which direction. But I can't because the street is straight. But I don't quite sort of know where I am because I don't have enough sky to tell me. And that means that we're sort of beginning to operate under quite a lot of stress in that city as we're walking along. So what about a slightly more open space? This is the Plaza de Armas in Cusco in Peru. It's very impressive. This is a very typical Spanish square. It's a rectangle with a squidgy bit. But it's basically a Spanish square. You'll find these all through Spain. Every village has a plaza, and all through Latin America, and they all have the same characteristic. You have God on one side, and you have the city government on the other. And this is a square where you go to be told what to do, or who to believe, or you go to see a punishment, or something like that. This is a square about power, the distribution of power in the city. On the other hand, if I go to Italy, I've always wanted to do a project looking at piazzas in Italy. I think this is, for some reason, nobody wants to fund it. This is Piazza delle Erbe in Verona, and you can see here, this is much smaller than the Plaza de Armas in Cusco, and you see lots of people here, and actually Italian piazzas were the place in the town, and still are, the place in the town where people meet. This is where trade happens, this is where conversations happen, you get the news. Not necessarily what the government wants to say, but you'll get the news, the real news. And that's all around the sort of shape as well. So it's quite interesting that compared with the Spanish plaza, this is almost an ellipse. It's a much warmer, more comforting kind of space, so people want to be in it. So this is a sort of socio-fugal place, whereas the other one isn't. And therefore what we want to try and figure out is, can we actually create the social spaces in a space like this more easily than we can in the Plaza de Armas? So we can come to London, and we have, this is an example, this is Exhibition Road. Now Exhibition Road is a shared space, so-called, near some other university. And what you find here is not actually terribly shared at all. Because actually you have all the traffic. Now, if you just simply showed somebody that photograph and said, what do you think that is? They'd say it's a street. It looks like a street, and you have cars in the middle and people on the side. So whether it actually functions as a shared space or not is sort of kind of interesting. But we do have that concept. If we look at it from sort of person eye view, it feels even more like an ordinary street. And you have the people very nice. We've even put bollards up here, look, to stop them from escaping into the actual traffic way. And then we park the cars on the space on the other side. So to me, this is a scheme that basically fails. What it's trying to do is to somehow or other get people and vehicles to manage themselves in the same space, it doesn't do that. They manage themselves by separating themselves back out. The only difference is we don't have a curb. We have a drain instead, and bollards. So it's not terribly shared. So this is, and that's part of the reason for that is partly because there's too much traffic going down there, but it's also, as a space, it's not one you want to be in. Whereas the Italian piazza is a space you would want to be in. Here's another kind of space. Now, this is a different version of verticality because I've been talking about the sun and the sky and the Sahara and things like that, but actually verticality, of course, happens in very little pieces. So this is one of the Circle Line trains brought in a few years ago, and one of the significant things about these trains is they had a floor which is very nearly at the same level as the platforms, compared with the previous trains, which were about 150 millimeters higher. And when they introduced these trains, I thought, this is great. We have level access, it's going to be absolutely fantastic, really good. So they had actually 6 times as many trips and falls on these trains as they had on the previous ones. And they thought, that's because they don't see the gap, because it's so small, so we'll put some lights on the gap. So they did a big experiment at Baker Street, lots of lights, and they had even more people tripping and falling. So clearly that wasn't actually fixing it. So we've been looking at that a bit. And the first thing that we found is that actually when people are standing here getting ready to get on the train, they're not looking at the floor. Of course, they're looking inside the train because they're trying to bag their spot in the train, because it's not usually as empty as that. And they're trying to figure out if they can get in the train, and if so, where they're going to go. So their eye is looking kind of horizontally at head height. And so any information about the train floor is coming through the very poor quality lower peripheral field of vision. So it's pretty, and the brain knows that's dodgy. Okay? The other piece of information they have going into one of those 11 million bits of information going into their brain is where their feet are. And they know that their feet, they're fairly familiar with the distance to your feet, so they know where the feet are. So they say, well, I know where the feet are, and my dodgy eye is telling me that the floor is maybe a little bit different from that, but that's dodgy, so I believe my feet. Therefore, when I start to move, the way I'm going to move is going to be driven by what I think my feet are doing and where they are, and it's therefore not cognizant, if you like, of that very small difference. And that's enough. You only need a couple of millimeters to start the trip. So that's the kind of thing that we're actually doing. So what we've actually got is this we're getting 2 sets of signals coming into the brain which conflict between what we're getting from the peripheral vision and what we're getting from the proprioception. So the question is what we do next. Well, that's what we're working on in the lab now. Because actually to solve that problem for London Underground, this is not about lights and signage. It's actually about figuring out how we actually get quite deep information, and where is that deep information going to go in the brain? It's going to go to the preconscious. That's the significant piece. The lights that they put in went to the conscious. And we need to get it at the preconscious because we want you basically not to have to think about it, but actually to lift the foot up. So that's what we're trying to figure out within the lab. So if we're getting people to interact with each other in the environment, we need to kind of think about how we're going to do that. Well, the first thing is that in those two-body problems, we have a two-body picture. We have, if you remember, our subjective and intersubjective environmental experience. This is part of our lived body, as is our time-based past, present, future experiences that we're dealing with. These are all in the lived body. Knowing about what we can actually do, how does our eye work, how does our ear work, how does our feet work and all that, this is the sort of third-person objective study type stuff of the living body. And the person in the middle is actually, of course, is both of those things. And so what does this actually mean for us? Well, the first thing to say is actually we know from our observations, scrupulously independently, are affected by things like harmony. People respond very differently to consonance than they do to dissonance. They are very affected by things like rhythm. We can make people walk faster by playing a slightly faster beat. Well, another thing I'm experimenting with is if we can actually reduce the amplitude of that beat so it's actually, you don't hear it. And does it still affect you? Because it probably does. But we're going to try that. What happens if we change the shape of the environment? The difference between the Cusco Square and the Piazza delle Erbe, can we actually change people's propensity to social interaction and therefore create a better sense of quality to life? And these are things which, up to a point, we can measure, but actually, of course, they're going to be affected by these. So the second thing is that time. Time is an absolutely essential part. I think we don't design space. We should not design space. I think we should design time. And we wrap, just like we might wrap space and buildings and infrastructure around our concept of social interaction, so we should actually design the time for that social interaction. How do we create that opportunity? And that is a massive opportunity for transport. Why should a bus stop be a pain that you have to endure in order to get on a bus? Why can't it be a great place to be? We have 20,000 of them in London. We can do really exciting things with bus stops in London to make them into something which people would like to be in, because that enables the social interaction that we can then incorporate as part of their better sense of experience in the transport system. Thirdly, one of the great things that the transport environment does is actually increases the number of experiences that we can have, because it takes us to them or brings experiences to us. So we have that kind of sense that we can actually do. So that means to understand better how we do that, we need to understand these intersubjective experiences. And what is it that people are looking for together and individually, and how does that actually work? And then we can design our transport system in order to deliver that. So, what can we say for transport? Well, I think the first thing I would do, I think we don't think of movement as something we either have to put up with or we don't want, but it's something we can actually think about, we create. How do we compose movement in a way? Think about how the feet are going to move, think about how people are going to move, etc. Not just individually, but also in volume, crowds. But actually what we have to think about is not just tolerating them going through a space. How do we actually create that into a positive cultural experience for people to go through that space? By using things like rhythm and harmony in order to be able to create that. And rhythm and harmony doesn't have to be music, it can be visual, it can be sensorial in other senses. So that's one thing we can think about. Second one, can we actually make sure that we get movement to resolve the inherent stresses of city life, all those tensions that we have, not actually increase them? And for a lot of people travelling around London, for example, the sense I have is the transport system is increasing their level of stress rather than decreasing it. And maybe we should make transport decrease it. For example, we could think about things like frequencies. Why do we just simply think frequencies defined by the number of people who want to use a bus and the number of people you can get in the bus? Because if you do that, you're just going to have crowded buses. Why don't we think about how long it is that people are prepared to wait for the bus? And there has been some effort in London to think about that. And you design your frequency according to waiting time rather than bus occupancy. What about designing to think about that collective, instantaneous, ephemeral experience? That experience is going to go away very fast. If we can actually make that into a great event, and we do experience that from time to time where that happens, can we actually make the transport journey one of those? The sort of thing, the sort of euphoria you get in things like a football game or in a concert or maybe even in a lecture, who knows. We need to work with the preconscious, and we don't know how to do that. So that is something we really need to get at. And to do that, we have to get our engineers and neurologists and people together to figure that out, which is, of course, what we now have just started a doctoral training program here to do that. So that's going to be very exciting when that turns out. We need to think about perception a lot more. We tend to think of perception as a bit sort of soft and waffly, but actually, if we want to create value, we have to get that perception piece done. And we have to think much more about the human scale. We have to think much more about how do we get the right amount of sky, sun, horizons, and so on, and how do we actually work with what we can do and what people can do instead of actually forcing us to do something because it's convenient for some arbitrary mechanical system. So I've got three provocations that I would put to you. One is, should we, all of this is about people, as you heard, should we actually, why do we talk about land use? Land doesn't use anything. It's just there. It's the people that use it. So why don't we talk about how people use transport rather than how land is used? And base our models on that. That would be one provocation. The second one is, how are we actually going to model transport systems when what we're actually talking about is what I perceive to be time, which might be longer or shorter than a Newtonian clock time. How do we, and we also know that at any one time, remember all those people on the train, everybody's sense of time is completely different and is changing differently all the time. So how do we actually do that? Well, we could put that in the too hard to do box, or we could actually sit down and see if we can do it. And I think a great provocation is, can we actually figure out to use the immense computing power that we now have available to us as to how we might want to do that? And finally, how do we incorporate the way in which we see phenomena in the transport system? Our first picture of what things are like, we don't know what's behind. And actually, if we can perceive things in a much more multidimensional way, maybe we can actually begin to understand much better how we can create a better quality of life while we are in the transport system. And so how do we actually incorporate that phenomenological perception into the transport system? If you're worried about what a phenomenological perception is, imagine you look at a house, what's at the back? We kind of know there's something at the back. But is it there? Actually, the image, in fact, is on the retina. And it's maybe not be there at all. So, one to think about. But actually, what I'm getting at is actually I think these are ways in which we could start to think differently about how we can incorporate people much better into the way in which we think about our transport system. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Nick, for what I think are three provocations, deeply philosophical, but actually fantastically practical as well. So I don't know quite how you do it, but it's amazing. So there is time for some questions. I know there are drinks downstairs, which probably are cold drinks, by the way, not hot drinks. So, any questions for Nick? Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps two small questions. Thank you, Nick, for taking.
Probably should say.
Is it ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your very interesting talk as always. Two perhaps questions. You can choose to disregard one of them. But the first one is: have you seen some evidence that the thinking about how transport systems are designed, it's changing, or whether there are certain places in the world where this is beginning to change? And the other question, which is quite different, is one of the things that perhaps the people in the savannah didn't have, or even 100 years ago didn't have, is the idea of virtual worlds, virtual spaces. And how do you think that is going to change the way that we think about how we move in this world?
Okay. So the first question was essentially, are there places around the world that are thinking differently about the transport system? And the second one was about basically the use of VR, virtual reality, and the virtuality of the world. The virtuality of the world. Yeah. Okay. So on the first one, I think a lot of places are thinking or trying to think differently about transport, and you see this often emerging in the sense of different approaches, for example, to walking and cycling as part of a transport mode as opposed to something that you try to get rid of, and also different kinds of modes. So we see a lot of work on things like bus rapid transit rather than light rail and metros and things like that. But you also see increasingly now, because there's a huge amount of interest in autonomous vehicles, and that obviously is quite new. But my worry is that all of those things, we still have at the back of our mind that very conventional way that we have an origin and a destination, and we have and there's something about the distance in between, which is a disincentive, and so on. And I just think surely there must be a more representative way of the way that people actually think and act that we could use in order to inspire those things. It may be that we come out with a bus rapid transit and an autonomous vehicle and lots of walking and cycling, but actually I think the thought process that drives that would make a better system. So I think, and we just don't really know how to do that. And I think that's true for anywhere, really. I don't see, I mean, I think we are learning to include more interest, for example, in health impacts of transport, both positive and negative, and things. And so I think there is, I'm not saying there isn't thinking going on. I just think we've got a very strong, and it's been very robust for 60 years or so, way of thinking about it. And as a provocation, maybe we should think again. And that's all I'm saying, really. So yes. So and the other thing is, I do think we are missing a trick on that, because we do it that way, we're missing the trick that comes from the arts, for example. In my case, particularly music, but it's not only music. What can we actually do with the visual arts? What can we do with dance? And so on, in order to change the way in which we perceive the world. And I think these are challenges that we can usefully address and change the way we think about how we think about transport. In terms of the virtuality, I mean, not just VR, you're thinking more about that we can do things on the internet. That's the kind of thing you're meaning?
Yes, it's just that our daily life is now permeated by living in virtual spaces.
Yeah. Okay.
And therefore, if you want to change the way that we perceive our A to B trip, that might also need to include a virtual space.
Yes, absolutely, and that's actually a very good point. I mean, there are coffee bars in London, for example, where their business model is that your coffee is free. And what you pay for is time. And what they provide, of course, is Wi-Fi access. And that allows for that to happen. And what that does is it means that your choice isn't between, do I go to work and work at work? Or do I stay at home and work at home? I can decide, well, today I think I'm going to go to somewhere and I will work there. And tomorrow I might be somewhere else. And I'm a bit fed up with that bloke next door to me here, so I'm going to do something else. And go. So the concept of a big commute in the morning and a big commute in the afternoon, which sort of drives a lot of the sense of need in the transport system, actually may be something that could be up for change. And if we're going to change it, how do we deal with a multi-origin, multi-destination type of pattern of working? That's quite different from the sort of models that we have now. So I think that does happen. On the virtual reality front itself, we did some interesting work with neuroscience on spatial memory. And one of the interesting things that came out of that, we found that when they were using the VR system, the humans had the same characteristics as rats. So they had place cells in their brain, and you have a neuron that fires only in one place. And you go to another neuron fires, and so on. You go back, and the original one does all that sort of stuff, which rats use very successfully to run around a maze. When we replicated the virtual reality experiment physically in the lab, we found that the human, we didn't do it with rats, okay, but the humans not only produced the place cells as they did, that's fine, they did all that before, but actually the trick that we learnt in the physical lab was that humans actually remembered the path. So the biggest predictor, for example, where they put something back, they picked something up, took it out of a room, went back into the room and asked to put it back. What they didn't know is we changed the room in the meantime. But when they put it back, so the predictor of where they put it was the path that they took to leave the room in the first place. And that's actually important because it means that there's a memory going on that is it in the brain at all? Is it somewhere else? And that goes very much into the agenda of the embodied mind in action kind of neurology. So that is something we're exploring in the doctoral training program.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. And I'm a student. I want to ask a very simple question. In your lecture, you mentioned we need to design the city into horizontal scale rather than the vertical scale. That means that a city area will become bigger, and it will reduce the business efficiency, I think. So how to solve it?
Yeah. I'm not going to flatten New York. Okay. I think, I mean, obviously tonight I can't go into everything, but part of the thinking is, instead of actually thinking of the city as a big city, you know, London, huge city, and then we think we're going to do this in this place and that in that place and so on, actually is to think in the opposite way. So actually, how do we design a space for 2 people to have a conversation? How do we design a space for 3 people to have a conversation? What's the design of the city that we put together in order to do that? How do you then build that up? So you build the city up from social interactions. And you have sets of these. And part of that is going to be how you actually decide to place things. So how do people's lives work? How much do they need to make long journeys and all that sort of thing? So if you go to North America, you find massive journeys. You know, the spread of a city like Atlanta, for example, is huge, the distances that people travel, compared with, say, Barcelona, which is similar population, but it's tiny, the amount of travel that they do. And I think a mistake is just to think that density fixes that. So it's not just a matter of the sport. I think it's a matter of how people live. So an example I like to use is if you go to Paris, what you find in Paris is that there's, I don't know how many there are actually, but there's lots of bread shops. And why are there lots of bread shops? Well, there's sort of 2 reasons, well, 2 and a bit reasons. One is the price of the bread is controlled, so it's cheap. It's a very much, in French cuisine, bread is a staple. It's very, very important. The second thing is the contents of a loaf are controlled. So you're not allowed to put any preservative in it. So the life of a loaf of bread in Paris is very short. You combine that with a Parisian's desire to have fresh bread, and they are buying bread 3, 4, 5 times a day. And therefore, you have lots of bread shops, and they walk to bread shops, even in a car-loving Paris, although that is interestingly changing at the moment. What it means is that you get a staple piece of your daily life very conveniently on foot. So one of the things that we've looked at in Latin America is, can we actually figure out what are the things that would fall into that category? What are the sort of things, you go to a community, what are the things you would like to get every day? And how do we do that? And then we make sure that that is in walking distance. And then you start, the great advantage of that is that you start that essential first journey out there to buy your bread or whatever it is, and then other journeys follow on from that. So we can start to change the pattern of movement in the city by actually not just sort of thinking globally, we're going to have a high street here or a supermarket there or an industry here, but actually thinking much more, how do we actually construct that living community, which will be relatively small, but we do it many times. And I think that is an interesting model to think about. And then how does that impact on the way we design our transport system? You combine that with the virtuality that we were talking about earlier, and do you need a long railway line? Do you need a long bus route? Maybe not. We have railway lines, they're a legacy. We're not really going to rip those up, in the short term at least. But we can think about what actually other means of transport and how that is delivered in a different way. And I think, there's no point in thinking about the transport system itself unless we actually think about how people are living their lives and what they're doing and where they're doing it. And thinking about the effect of the one on the other at that quite local scale. So I think one could do it, but as I was saying earlier, we still have to rethink a bit the way we put it all together.
Thank you. My question or comment is partly prompted by the first question about have you seen places where this is happening? And it seems to me that basically you brought in a lot of new and rather wonderful thinking to something that we've all been saying for a long time. It's new arguments for the same answer.
Sure.
Making better places, the work that Peter's done. And if you take, your opening could be a summary of the Traffic in Towns report. If we keep doing the same thing, we're going to end up with more congested cities and worse places. And we're all doing this, generation after generation of planners, in a bit of an echo chamber. We all agree with each other, and each generation adduces new and better ideas for why it should happen. So my sort of lingering question is, who's going to pay for it? Because, hey, I'm pathetic. And it strikes me that question the lad down there asked about where is it happening. There are lots of places, very often through European programs, where demonstration programs have been done on exactly this kind of place changing and shaping that shows economic quality, social, community benefits, and measures them. So we can actually marry this sort of fresh thinking with some very hard arguments to take this discussion out of the lecture theatre and into Whitehall.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, that's sort of kind of what we're trying to do, and why it's so important that we can actually demonstrate things. It's all very well for me to talk about somebody tripping over a 10mm gap, but actually seeing what we can do about that and actually seeing it with your own eyes is actually very important. It's very interesting. We have a proposal going in for some work about how you light a zebra crossing. And currently, you have to light a zebra crossing so that it's 3.5 times as bright on the crossing itself as it is on the road either side. And I asked why this was the case. And first of all, nobody knew. And then they said, in the 1930s, when this regulation was made, Philips had 2 levels of bulb. And so that's why it was the way it was. But actually, it's a bit stupid, because if you put a light, and you'll see these on zebra crossings now, you see they do it a lot now with LEDs, a big bright light on the crossing itself. But actually, if you light, need my pen again, here we are. If you light a person is actually a tall, thin object. And if you put a light up here, it's just going to shine on the top. And all the sides of the object are still actually pretty dark. So the driver approaching this zebra crossing 100 meters away, it's actually quite hard to see the pedestrian. On the other hand, the pedestrian is bathed in this 3.5 times brighter light. So the pedestrian believes they are completely visible. So we've got a proposal to fix this, right? And so the idea is we do some work up in Sheffield with the driver simulator, and we can get them driving car in the simulator and see how they respond to pedestrians under different kinds of lighting arrangements. Okay, and then what we will do in our laboratory is to create the zebra crossing at life scale with pedestrians and light the pedestrian crossing under different ways, and we'll see how they feel about that, and then we will bring the two together. So we will then come up with an idea of, well, we could light the zebra crossing like this or like that or whatever. And what we all know is that if we were to do that in the conventional way, we would write papers and reports, and we would go and have meetings and do all this sort of stuff. And about 25 years later, we might be able to change a regulation on the lighting of zebra crossings. So instead of doing that, the idea in this proposal is we create the street in the laboratory. We have the car in the laboratory, we have the pedestrian crossing, and we have the pedestrians in the laboratory, and we have a pop-up theatre around this arrangement, and we take all the people that are going to be involved in this, and we say, here you are, here's the street. If we do it like this, this is what happens. How do you feel about that? If we do it like that, this is what happens. How do you do about that? And we think we can actually shorten that process massively in order to get that done, because we can actually get people to see for themselves what it is and understand what we're talking about in a way that you just cannot do from the printed page. So I think we can demonstrate. I think there is a place for that kind of facility to be able to do that kind of thing in the world, because it's the halfway between the kind of stuff that they do in a neurology laboratory, if you like, and actually just doing something on the street, which is incredibly difficult to do and expensive and so on. So we can make that change a lot easier, so that we can make those demonstrations much, much more impactful and effective. And that's kind of what the way that we're approaching. Because you're quite right, that is the way forward. People have to see and hear and smell and understand these things for themselves to be able to believe them. So that's kind of the approach that we're looking for. So we can jump on the back of those demonstrations to be able to do that. There's one up there.
Thank you. I'm just wondering what you think about whether we're in danger of becoming prisoners of our physiology. I mean, I know people in New York, and I'm reminded of a Seinfeld episode where he panics because he can't manage more than 4 friends. And I have friends that if they go in a pub and the landlord gets the pint they usually have ready, they'll move on and go to another pub. And that's what they like about city living, the anonymity of it. So I just wonder if there's a slight element of romanticism here about how we would design a city.
Yes, probably. But why not?
Downstairs, you.
But actually, I suppose I would answer, well, why not? I mean, I don't think, I'm certainly not advocating that we have an experience where you are ordered to go and have a chat with somebody at a bus stop. And I'm not suggesting that for a minute. What I'm suggesting is that we can create a space in which that would feel like something you would wish to do, but if you chose not to do it, that's fine. So, example of that, I encountered a bus station in Nicosia. And in the bus station in Nicosia, I got very excited because they had a bench that was curved, like a sort of polite S-shaped bench. And so the people on the inside of the curve were sitting there chatting away, and the people on the outside of the curve were sitting there doing their emails. And when somebody else arrived, a new person arrived, and they obviously wanted to know something about the buses, because there aren't very many in Nicosia, so you would want to know about them. They arrived, and of course the side they went to was the internal one where the social space was happening. But you could actually choose not to be social. That was quite possible. The interesting thing is that further up in the bus station, there was a straight bench, because they hadn't replaced it, and nobody sat on the straight bench. There were just people standing around doing their emails. There was no sociality there at all. So I think we can design to allow for what we might loosely call sociality to happen, but it can still be very voluntary, and we're not having to impose it. So I think we can sort of get that sense of choice maybe back, and that would be quite a good thing, I think, because maybe it is romantic, but maybe cities should be romantic. Maybe we should actually be feeling much more about having a good quality of life and less about having to sort of rush down the escalator to get down to the train and get on the thing and go. Everything is all a big rat race. And maybe that's actually where we need to be.
Can I suggest we actually leave the formal questions at that point and perhaps catch up with Nick over a drink, which is not enforced but highly desirable. But before you disappear, thank you once again, Nick, for starting off this series in a utterly provocative fashion. The next provocation will be delivered by Isabel Dedring, who's currently the global head of transport at Arabs, and who's formerly London's deputy mayor for transport and the deputy chair of Transport for London. And her provocation is beautifully entitled, "Transport is Dead. Long live transport." So thank you once again, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.